Welcome back to the Bite Pod. Today we're exploring trade compliance in the pharmaceutical industry, an area that demands constant vigilance as regulations evolve and global supply chains shift. From navigating complex FDA and DEA requirements to adapting to geopolitical uncertainty and increased enforcement, pharma companies face mounting pressures to get compliance right. I'm joined today by Beth Lomax, a seasoned trade compliance professional and pharmaceutical and healthcare industry specialist. As a customs and trade compliance consultant, Beth works with companies to improve their import and export processes, reduce supply chain risk, and build trade compliance frameworks that actually work. She brings deep hands-on experience in areas like classification, export control, broker management, and compliance training. We're so happy to have you here with us today, Beth. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Before we jump into today's topic, a quick note about Bite. We are building tools to make compliance faster, smarter, and more actionable. So we are giving teams the screening and workflow support that they need to stay ahead of risk. That includes robust denied party screening, customizable alerts, and tools built for real-world compliance challenges. And conversations like this help shape what we build next. So jumping in, Beth, if you don't mind just taking us through a little bit of your background. Our listeners love to hear how our experts got into the world of trade compliance, and for you, especially into the pharmaceutical industry.
Sure. I think like a lot of people who are in trade compliance, I fell into the profession. It really wasn't an intentional career path, although it turned out to be a very good one. So right out of university, I had a job in procurement for a company that did stainless steel surgical instruments. They were all imported from small suppliers in southern Germany. So I didn't have any experience in procurement. I think they hired me because I could speak German. And so they needed someone who could communicate with these suppliers. So I started out learning about procurement, but because the goods were all imported, the person who had previously managed that left, and my boss came to me and said, would you like to manage the import side of things along with the purchasing? So I said, sure. I didn't know anything about it, but I thought, might as well learn. So that's how I became exposed to the area and interested in the area. And it's very niche because there's few people that really know about importing and exporting, even fewer when it comes to pharmaceuticals or medical devices. So after that job, then I worked for a law firm in their customs and international trade practice, and that was really helpful because it helped me learn about the import export regulations and the laws and how to read them and where to look for them and what they all meant. And then I also spent some time working at Ernst & Young in their international trade practice, which was really good because then I got exposure to a lot of different industries and a lot of different trade issues, not just in healthcare. And then I took my broker's exam because I thought that would be a good way to learn, but also a good like a good accreditation to have, so people would know what my expertise was. So after I left Ernst & Young, though, I decided I missed industry and I want to go back to industry. So then I started working for Novartis Pharma, first in the United States, developing their US global trade compliance program. And then I moved to Switzerland because there was no global trade compliance program. So then I headed up the global trade compliance program, actually built that out completely from scratch. And then at a certain point, I thought, well, I have all this expertise in import export, especially in the pharma world. I'd like to use that. So I came back from Switzerland, went back to the US and decided to start my own consulting firm so that I could use all this knowledge to help clients. And so now I work a lot with medium to small size pharmas and biotechs that are just developing their global supply chains, or they don't really have a very sophisticated global supply chain, and they don't have this expertise. So they have good expertise in supply chain, but it's this part of the supply chain that they don't have expertise in, and that's where I come in and help them.
Super interesting, and yeah, you're right. I feel like everyone we talk to is like, it wasn't an intentional move. I didn't intend to get into trade compliance, but super interesting. And what I heard too is you just said yes to all of the opportunities for learning that were put in front of you, which is so commendable. Just to keep saying yes to learning more, and you never know where it'll bring you.
Exactly.
Yeah. So kind of pulling on what you also mentioned there at the end. So a lot of times people may have expertise in supply chain, but what makes trade compliance unique or more complex in the pharmaceutical sector compared to other industries?
I think for pharma, it is the existence of all the PGA requirements that you have to meet to import your goods. So I think for customs, it's really straightforward for pharma. You've got country of origin classification. That's not really that difficult. Value, that can be a little bit tricky because a lot of times, even when you're in the clinical stages, you're paying suppliers on milestones or you're doing payments for tech transfer. And so you need to figure out what needs to actually be included in your import value. Other than that, I think customs is relatively straightforward. Where pharma really needs to focus and pay attention to where the difficulties come up, especially is the FDA import requirements. I think that's probably the toughest part of importing pharma. What are the FDA requirements? What data, what documentation do I need to show that the imported goods meet these requirements? What mechanisms can I even use to import my goods? Because FDA has only certain mechanisms for importing goods at different stages of development, especially when it's still in R&D or clinical phases. There's only certain ways that you can import because FDA wants to make sure that unapproved drugs do not get into the supply chain and harm the public. So they take that mission very seriously. So you have to make sure that you really know what the requirements are. You have all the information that you need to show FDA that the goods meet them and so they can be released. Otherwise, you will definitely have problems. Goods will be on hold. You'll have delays in the supply chain. So you definitely don't want that. So you need processes in place to make sure that you know the requirements and you have all the right data and documents. I think for pharma, the other big agency that maybe people don't think of is USDA's APHIS, which is the Animal Plant and Health Inspection Service. So for drugs that contain any kind of animal or animal-derived component, they are regulated by APHIS. And so they would need an import permit. There are certain exceptions to the permits. So you need to know what those exceptions are and then what criteria do you need to meet in order to qualify for those exceptions so that you know when you need a permit and when you don't. But certain things like that are very common in pharmaceuticals, like lactose, it's often used as a excipient or a binder. If it's a porcine or bovine origin, that's an animal product. So any drug that contains that could potentially, is regulated by APHIS, and could potentially require a permit. And then new kinds of drugs, like drugs that contain monoclonal antibodies, enzymes or proteins that are produced in animal cell lines. Again, that's an animal-derived product. So those drugs are also regulated by APHIS. Again, under certain conditions, they could be exempt from permits, but under others, they may require permit. And then you also have things like if you import primate material, if you're doing research on that, or if it's feline or fish or amphibian derived material, which isn't that common in drugs, but you do find drugs that do have products derived from those kinds of animals. Those are also regulated by APHIS. So again, you really need to know what the requirements are, what's in your product so that you know, is it regulated by APHIS? And again, what is the data and the documentation I need to present so that I can get a release by APHIS? Because you need a customs release, you need an FDA release, you would need an APHIS release. You would need release from all three. Then you have the DEA, as you'd mentioned. So if your drugs are controlled, there's reporting and permitting requirements for those. Another one that comes up that is not really well known is Fish and Wildlife Service. So for animal tissue that you might be importing for research, or if you're importing a cell line, that could be regulated by Fish and Wildlife. If you're importing any kind of material or animal tissue from an endangered animal, like for example, I had a company that was importing tissue from macaque monkeys to use for research. Macaque monkeys are an endangered species. So they are regulated by the CITES Convention, which is administered by Fish and Wildlife. So that would require an import permit. There's all kinds of things that you could catch you up in that you may not realize unless you understand what the requirements are. And then some of the fish and wildlife stuff may overlap with APHIS. So there's overlapping requirements, and you need to make sure that you meet the requirements at each agency. So that's where the complexity comes in for pharma, is the requirements for these PGAs.
How can pharma people in the industry even successfully navigate all of this?
It's kind of difficult. I think experience is a good teacher. You make mistakes, and drugs get held up and then you learn. Obviously that's not the best option. You can contact an expert like myself who can help guide you through it. There are seminars and conferences that you can go to where there are customs and trade compliance conferences, but lots of times they have sessions that focus on the different agencies, so you can learn about their requirements, what you need to do. So that's also helpful. A lot of the agencies, I wish they would do more of this, but sometimes they do outreach to the trade. So they'll have a webinar, for example, or they'll publish something that will help people understand what the requirements are. And if you're starting in a trade compliance group and you're just coming in as the entry-level analyst, for example, learn from your colleagues because they've been doing this for years. They're a very good source of knowledge that they can pass on to you that you can learn from. But I think, yeah, unfortunately or fortunately, I think you just need to be in the industry and you just need to do and you need to learn it as you go. I think that's probably the way most people end up learning about these requirements.
Yeah, and one thing, this wasn't in our notes for today, but I know you and I have had the conversation before too around the complications. Classification as a rule is a complicated thing to do, but then adding in like the knowledge that you need in pharma also is yet another challenge that I know you talked about.
Right, yeah. Classifying a finished dosage form drug, not that difficult because you just need to know what the indication is. But if you're classifying APIs, you need chemical knowledge, and a lot of people don't have the chemical knowledge. So it can be very difficult to correctly classify APIs and other research materials, research compounds. So again, there's our organizations that I just attended one in March where a trade organization had a whole seminar on how to classify goods of chapter 28 and 29. It was really interesting, really helpful. But again, if you don't have a chemistry background, it's a lot of information to take in. So again, finding someone who has that chemical knowledge. So if you're a trade compliance person and you have classification knowledge, if you can partner up with someone who has chemical knowledge and you can combine your two brains, I think that's a good way to figure out what the classifications should be and reach a good conclusion. Again, there's experts that really focus on chemical classification, and because they have a chemical background, you can find those people too and bring them in when you need them.
Very interesting. So just moving on a little bit, I mean, very tied to classification in some ways, but how would you describe global trends, like shifting manufacturing hubs or geopolitical tensions impacting pharma trade compliance specifically?
I think the biggest global geopolitical trend right now is obviously the tariffs or the threat of potential tariffs
Yeah.
on pharmaceuticals. So right now they're exempt except for China. So the question is what's coming down the pike? And so the administration has already issued a 232 investigation into the national security impact and threat of imported pharmaceuticals. So, based on the statutory timelines, there will be a decision at some point about whether or not the administration will impose sectoral tariffs on pharmaceuticals. Right now, companies have the ability to comment. I think the comments are due on May 7th. So that's coming up. Whether they'll actually pay attention to the comments, we shall see. So I think that's the biggest change because that's going to force pharmaceutical companies possibly to figure out what do we need to do with our sourcing? Do we need to change sources? Do we need to change where we manufacture? So that means trade compliance people are going to have to react and quickly update their regulatory requirements and regulatory data so that when these goods are imported from these new countries or in these new trade lanes, they have all the right data and documents so that they can submit that to FDA, everything is fine, and the goods don't get held up so that they're cleared quickly. So that's going to be something that trade compliance teams are going to be really busy with, is keeping up with all the changes in the supply chain. And they're going to have to work very closely with their customs brokers to ensure that they have all the correct data and have good communication with their brokers so that when there are delays, they can resolve them quickly. So I think trade compliance is getting a lot of attention now, and it's good that they're getting attention, but I wish it were for other reasons than tariffs. So, trade compliance often is not noticed unless something goes wrong, as long as everything is flowing freely and quickly and there's no holdups. No one really sees effort that goes into making sure that that happens. So now trade compliance is being tapped for information and knowledge on what all this tariff stuff means, what goods will be impacted, what trade lanes will be impacted, what it means from a financial standpoint, and what can be done to mitigate the impact and the stress on the supply chain. So that again, trade compliance people will be showing their value. And that's good, but again, I wish it was for different reasons. And I think, as far as shifting manufacturing hubs, pharma is a little bit limited in where they can go because you need certain technology and you need a skilled workforce and you need a country that is capable of meeting FDA good manufacturing practices in the manufacturing process. And there are only certain ones that can do that. So if you want to market your goods in the developed world, US, Canada, Europe, Australia, Japan, you need to meet GMP requirements no matter where you're manufacturing. So that means most manufacturing is going to happen in the US or the EU, Japan, Canada, or Singapore. You do manufacturing in some other countries, but that's usually for local consumption because you don't have the same kind of GMP requirements. So because pharma is very global, and usually you produce goods for global consumption in maybe only one or two places, you really are limited to these countries where they can meet GMP requirements. So it'll be interesting to see how pharma reacts to tariffs based on how the tariffs are structured. So if they have any kind of country of origin requirements or there's any kind of exemptions for certain countries, what those will be and how they can then organize their supply chain to take advantage of that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about the GMP standards. It brings a whole nother layer of complexity to the supply chain.
Exactly.
And have you seen in recent years an increase in enforcement or audits in pharma, or what has that been looking like?
Actually, in the last couple of years, have not seen any increase in enforcement. You kind of have periodic blips where certain agencies may be looking at something more closely. Every once in a while, APHIS kind of hones in on a certain kind of product, but that usually isn't lasting. So no, I haven't seen any increase in pharma related audits from CBP, for example. For FDA, they don't really do audits for imports specifically. If they need to do a site inspection for FDA registration purposes, then they might want to look at imports and look at some records, but they might not. So they don't actually specifically audit the imports. But with all the tariffs, and if there's the tariffs that are in place now, but any sectoral tariffs that would be put in place in pharma, if they have complex requirements, that's going to mean a lot more opportunities for companies to unintentionally make mistakes. And then it will be incumbent upon customs to make sure that they're meeting these requirements. So customs will have a lot more work to do. I think now, even people are talking about how customs will increase its scrutiny of country of origin because that's how the tariffs are based. And then I've also seen things that the government says it will start using the False Claims Act to prosecute importers that don't submit accurate data, either intentionally or unintentionally, to get around tariffs or just because they didn't have the right processes in place to determine what the right information is. I think the question there is, how will CBP have the resources to do this with all the other government cuts and all the other things that CBP has to pay attention to? Because obviously there's a lot of other things. Forced labor is something that they've really been focusing on lately. So will forced labor kind of go to the background a little bit, where country of origin audits then increase, or will it be no shift at all? I think it's very incumbent on what kind of resources that CBP has. I think the government and the administration can say all they want that they will look at this, but someone needs to to do that. And so CBP needs people. So we'll see how that plays out. I think it would be smart for companies to anticipate that that might happen.
Yeah, and it's interesting you brought up forced labor. We've been having this conversation a lot as kind of we talk about how trade compliance has always been important, and tariffs have brought a more consumer-focused spotlight onto trade compliance. But for the trade compliance community, it's, 2 years ago it was forced labor, and everyone was, trying to figure out how they were going to react to forced labor and get all of that in order and ready. And now, I'm sure then it was de minimis, then it was tariffs. Now again, it's de minimis today, today specifically.
Yeah.
But, it seems like there's always there for the trade compliance community, there's always something new that you're having to react to. Is that like a correct assessment? And
I think so, yeah, because you're right. You had forced labor and then you have de minimis, and then you have these tariffs where country of origin is becoming really, really important. But if you look back, after 9/11, it was all the supply chain security stuff and importer self-assessment. And so there's always something new. And I actually feel quite sorry for customs because they're constantly tasked with administering and enforcing a new program. And so their agreement has just exploded. So yeah, there's just a lot you need to pay attention to.
yeah, definitely. And what role would you say technology plays in helping pharma companies stay compliant, or what role do you wish it would play or could play for that industry?
I think it does play a very important role, and then I'll talk about the role I wish it would play. And so it's really important because of just the sheer amount of data that you need to make sure that you're compliant with customs and all the other PGAs, especially for pharma. And you need a way to manage all that data. And I think using technology is a good way to do that. So you could create a product master that has all of your import data for all the different agencies, so that every time you do an import, you know what the data is, you can shoot that to the broker, you can use that to create documents if you need to, and then everything is consistent and accurate. So you determine all the accurate data to put it into the system. So every time you pull it out, you know it's the right data, and it's going to be consistent across all your entries. So I think that's good because that's something that customs would notice if you're importing the same thing and you're doing it differently every time. Their systems that look at this would potentially pick up on it. So I think it's good to be consistent. And then, you need, especially with all the impact of the tariffs or potential impact of the tariffs, that data has become even more important. So how can you pull all the data together about what you're importing, what its value is, what are the HTS codes, so you can actually do some analysis on what are the impacts of the tariffs. So if you don't have a good way to gather all that data, you're at a disadvantage for trying to plan for how to mitigate or the impact of the tariffs, or to have a strategy for the tariffs. So I encourage a lot of my clients to automate wherever they can. Since I work with a lot of small and medium-sized companies, they often don't have the budgets to automate. But at a minimum, if they would just have a system that would help them have a product database, create documents, even on the export side, do export screening, because a lot of them don't do that at all. And so it's one thing I really encourage them to do. You really need to do this, because if you don't, and there's an issue, that's a huge problem. So I think they need to use technology, but they don't really need a super sophisticated system. And I think now there's just a lot of systems out there with a lot of different functionality. So you can find one that fits, even if you need something that's more simple and not as sophisticated. So a lot of these pharma companies don't really have sophisticated ERP systems that they can then hook onto a system. They may not have an ERP system at all. They're still doing demand planning on spreadsheets. But some of these systems, you don't need to connect it to an ERP system. It can be self-sufficient or independent. But I think it's just having a way to deal with all of that data and not have people do repetitive tasks all the time and let technology do some of that. Then you can focus on things that add more value. So you can focus on things that are more strategic in nature, and not focus on the busy work. So that frees up a lot of time for your trade people to do more valuable things. So that, yeah, I would, I like technology and I wish more of my clients would implement technology. So I don't know if it's really a question of what I wish the technology would do. I think there's a lot of good technology out there that does a lot. I wish pharma companies would realize what it can do and realize that a small investment in technology could really have big returns.
Yeah, definitely. And we've talked with others as well about there are ways for small teams or teams with limited resources to really build a good compliant trade compliance program. It doesn't need to be, a huge money pit or anything like that. Like you can do a lot with limited resources.
Yeah, it's once you have if you have a system, even if it's rather simple, that not only can you manage the day-to-day data you need for the entries, but then you can also pull on that, like I said, for the tariffs, but also for auditing purposes to go back and see how has everything been working? Are there instances where I haven't submitted the right data? Do I need to do a PSC? Do I need to do any kind of prior disclosure? I think that's really valuable to have as well.
Yeah, definitely. Are there any trends or changes? I know we were just talking, we're already in May. So, almost to the halfway point of the year. So, in the end of the year 2025, what should compliance teams prepare for now?
Um, Tariffs, I think is the big one. Having some, even though we don't know what any sectoral tariffs may look like on pharmaceuticals, I think it would be really prudent to put together some kind of plan based on what they could potentially be and how they could potentially impact the supply chain. So, how can you use trade organizations too to help you educate yourself on what are the plans for the tariffs, maybe even use the trade organization to advocate for more advantageous position for the tariffs, because I think the more voices that are heard, the better that is. And so like we had talked about too, I think because of the tariffs, country of origin marking is going to be really important. How do you determine the country of origin so that you know whether your goods are susceptible to tariffs or not? The other thing that's coming up that Pharma needs to, actually it's here, that Pharma needs to pay attention to is enforcement of an existing requirement for country of origin marking for imported goods that will be repackaged and then sold, especially for drugs, repackaged and sold after importation and then sold to a customer at a retail pharmacy. So customs has this bee in their bonnet that the bottle that you get from your retail pharmacy, if you're getting a drug from CVS or Walgreens, does not have the country of origin on it. And so according to customs marking rules, the end user, which is the person who's buying this at a retail pharmacy, needs to know the country of origin of the products that they're buying. So they need to know the origin of the drug. So there's always been this requirement that if you bring in a product, especially a drug, and then you're sending it off to another partner, so you import it in bulk, for example, you send it off to another partner who will package it and label it. And that is the bottle that will go to the pharmacy. And then from that bottle, the drug will be dispensed to the actual customer at the pharmacy.
The little orange bottle, right?
Right, the little orange bottle. So so the importer needs to notify any subsequent repackager of this requirement to maintain that country of origin marking all the way to the retail customer. So there's always been a requirement that a notification that importers need to send to the repacker to notify them of that, also to notify customs, hey, this will be repacked. But it just really hasn't been enforced. And I don't know of any pharma companies who really do it. When I was at Novartis, we didn't do it. It just wasn't enforced, even though it was on the book. So now, like I said, customs has this bee in their bonnet that the retail customer needs to know the country of origin. So they are starting to enforce this notification along the supply chain of the requirement to maintain the country of origin. So that is something that customs will now be looking for when you import drugs. And that's a potential reason that they could detain the drugs or hold them and not let you import them until they can see proof that you have done the proper notification. So companies really need to put processes in place in order to issue that notification to the next repacker that they're then delivering the drugs to. So that's something that's quite new. And then I think forced labor somewhat, again, I think CBP may be a little distracted based on all the other things that they're going to need to do now. So we'll see what happens with forced labor. And it hasn't been a huge issue for pharma because pharma typically doesn't manufacture in countries where forced labor is an issue because, again, you need more skilled labor to manufacture drugs. But it does come up periodically. So I think that's something that pharma trade compliance still needs to be cognizant of and watch out for so that they don't get tripped up at some point.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, as we said, there's always something in trade compliance that makes it complex and makes people need to, pay attention to everything that's changing and keep track of it all. So, thank you so much for sharing what you see as coming up. You've definitely throughout this conversation offered some insights and tips, but any advice or tips that you would give to someone who's newer in the space or trying to get a handle on pharma trade compliance?
Sure. I think the first thing is to just be curious and be open to the opportunity for getting involved in trade compliance and discovering trade compliance as a challenging, interesting, and expanding field. Because I really think it is expanding. It's getting a lot more attention. Global supply chains are very global in all industries. And so companies are starting to realize that we need experts in how to get things across borders and make sure that we're meeting all the requirements so we don't have any delays in our supply chain. So I think, things like there are certification courses now. There weren't a lot a couple years ago, but now there's a lot more certification courses for importers and for exporters. I would definitely recommend taking the broker exam. That's a really good way to learn customs processes and procedures and classification, because there are questions that focus on classification and they're quite difficult. I had the advantage of taking the exam many years ago when it was not as difficult. It is more difficult. You do need to study. But I think the fact that you can pass the exam and you get your broker's license, that's a good qualification. I would also say join trade organizations. There's a lot of good ones out there because they have a lot of industry specific groups. I belong to one that's specific to healthcare and the American Association of Exporters and Importers. There's another one called Import Compliance Professionals Association, or ICPA, which is really good. Both of them have conferences. ICPA has multiple conferences a year, actually. And so they're good opportunities to stay up to date on recent topics, also to learn about just basic customs procedures. And also, really importantly, it's a good opportunity to meet other people in trade compliance in networks. So that you have some people that you can go to because you have a question and say, I have trouble with this. How do you handle this? Or how do you interpret this regulation? I think it's really important to have a network to bounce things off. I do that a lot with the healthcare group that I'm involved in with the AAI, and it's super helpful. And then, like I said, you just learn by doing. You just get involved in the processes, and that's just a good way to learn from your colleagues who have a lot of industry experience. Because you can learn so much from classes and seminars and webinars, but you actually need to put that knowledge into practice in order to be able to really learn it. So for classification or even determining ECCNs for exports, that just takes experience. You just need to do it. So get a good basis of knowledge and then just start doing it.
Yeah. You mentioned the broker's exam. I was following a conversation on LinkedIn this week, and someone posted, I got it after the third time, and it started this whole conversation of people saying how many times they took the exam, and the people who passed it in the first time were saying like first timer here, it sounds like I myself have never taken it, but it sounds like quite the achievement to pass that. And
Definitely. Their pass rate is not, it's less than 50%. I think it's way less than 50%. I haven't seen the latest statistics. I think one year it was less than 10. And so they actually had to revamp the test because they wanted a few more people to pass
Yeah.
than just 10%. But yeah, it is hard. It does take a lot of study, but if you can pass it, you will learn a lot. And it's a really good qualification to have when you're looking for a job.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much for being on with me today. If there's anything else you want to, any pearls of wisdom you want to leave our listeners with, feel free. Anything else that you wanted to add?
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot. I think I probably dropped most of my pearls of wisdom already. So yeah, thanks for having me. It was really fun to talk about what I do because it does need more attention. People need to know what trade compliance is and how important it is. I realize that it's an ongoing thing. It's a function that you need within your supply chain to be continuous. So it's not something you can just implement on a project basis and then just forget about it and walk away. It has to be something that's continually worked at.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and thanks so much for being on. If people want to get in touch with you, what is the best way for them to reach out to you to tap into your
The
expertise?
best way is to find me on LinkedIn. So you can look for me under Elizabeth Lomax. You can also search Lomax Associates Inc. So I do have a company page, but there's not much on it. Everything about my business is on my personal page. So that's probably the best way to get in touch with me. And I have my email address on that as well. So you can either reach out through LinkedIn DMs or send me an email.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. And that wraps up another episode of the Bite Pod. We'll be back in a few weeks and look forward to seeing you all then.